That night began like any other, with the familiar comfort of routine and the quiet assurance that we had each other, the kind of unspoken understanding that marriages are built on over the years. I thought I knew him, thought I understood his moods, his silences, the way his eyes shifted when he was deep in thought. But that night, something changed, something shifted so abruptly and so completely that I realized I didn't really know him at all, or maybe I didn't know myself in the context of us. The argument started small, almost innocuously, a comment here, a tone there, something that should have been brushed off, something that in another time or another life might have faded into nothingness. But instead, it ignited a storm. The air between us thickened instantly, turning our home from a haven into a battlefield, and I could feel a chasm opening, wide and terrifying, like it had been there all along, hidden under years of familiarity and unspoken routines. I remember the exact moment I felt the shift when the words first hit me, not even his harshest words, just the way he said them, clipped, cold, and distant, like he was speaking to a stranger instead of the person he had promised to love through sickness and health. It was jarring, a sudden reminder that intimacy is delicate, fragile, and can vanish in an instant when anger or hurt takes control. I looked at him across the room, hoping for a flicker of recognition, for a sign that he understood the gravity of what was unfolding, but his eyes were distant, unreadable, a reflection of the distance I suddenly felt creeping into my own chest. It was like staring into a mirror and not recognizing the person staring back. I realized then that the fight was no longer just about the initial issue. It was about layers of unspoken frustrations, misunderstandings, and disappointments that had accumulated over time, like sediment slowly building at the bottom of a river, hidden until the dam finally breaks. In that moment, I felt as if the foundation of everything I had believed about our marriage was crumbling beneath my feet. I kept asking myself silently, is this what marriage is? Is this the depth of pain it can bring? Because the hurt was raw and immediate. It wasn't the petty frustrations of daily life. It was something deeper, something primal, something that tore through the familiarity and the routines and left me exposed, vulnerable, and utterly unprepared. Every word he spoke felt like it carried the weight of years of misunderstanding and resentment, each one striking me with a precision that left me breathless. I wanted to speak, to explain, to reach out and bridge the widening gap, but the words lodged in my throat, heavy and unspeakable. I noticed how even the smallest gestures, the ones that normally would comfort or reassure, suddenly felt alien. A touch that once felt warm now seemed distant, almost foreign. A glance that once conveyed love now felt like scrutiny, judgment, or worse, indifference. The familiarity I had relied on was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of estrangement. It was as if the person I had known and loved had been replaced by a stranger who knew all the same facts about me, my habits, my routines, my fears, but had no access to my heart. The sense of being unknown and unseen, of standing in the same room with someone who feels like a stranger, is a unique kind of ache, one that seeps into your bones and leaves a hollow echo in its wake. As the argument escalated, the words became sharper, but it was not only the words that hurt. It was the tone, the pauses, the silences in between. Every pause was a reminder that connection had faltered. Every silence was a gaping void where understanding should have lived. I felt like I was navigating an emotional minefield, unsure where the next step would trigger another explosion. It was terrifying and alien, this feeling of complete and sudden estrangement from someone who had once been the center of my world. I realized that sometimes in a marriage, you can fight not just about the surface issues, but also about the buried fears, the unspoken disappointments, and the unmet expectations that quietly accumulate. That night, all of those things came rushing to the surface at once, like an unstoppable tide. In the midst of this, I began to reflect on the years we had spent together. How could someone I had shared so much with laughter, dreams, hopes, and countless quiet evenings become someone I barely recognized? The shock of it was visceral, the grief immediate. I thought of all the moments I had trusted him, leaned on him, believed in the promises we had made, and suddenly those memories felt like fragile glass, beautiful but breakable at the slightest touch. I understood for the first time that marriage is not a static bond. It is a living, breathing entity that requires attention, care, and constant nurturing. And when neglected, even slightly, it can reveal fissures that are far deeper than imagined. The estrangement wasn't just one-sided. I could sense that he, too, was frustrated, hurt, and perhaps scared. But in the heat of the moment, there was no empathy, no bridge of understanding, only the raw clash of emotions. We were both trapped in our own perspectives, unable to step into each other's shoes, unable to remember that beneath the anger and disappointment was still love, still the person we had chosen years ago. That night was a cruel teacher, showing me how easily love can be overshadowed by pride, misunderstandings, and the unhealed wounds we carry into our relationships. As the fight wore on, I felt the slow, painful realization that even in marriage, you can be completely alone. Not physically alone, but emotionally isolated in a way that shakes the very foundation of your identity. To be with someone and feel like a stranger in their presence is one of the most painful experiences a heart can endure. It is a strange paradox. You are bound by vows, by shared history, by love, and yet in moments of conflict, all of that can feel irrelevant, almost non-existent. The intimacy that once defined your connection suddenly feels like a distant memory, leaving behind only the raw, unvarnished reality of two individuals confronting their own vulnerabilities and disappointments. By the end of that night, I was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. I felt as though I had been stripped bare, left to confront the fragility of love and the reality of human relationships in their rawest form. I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that the rift between two people is not always caused by a single action or word, but by the accumulation of small, unspoken grievances, moments of neglect, misunderstandings, and unaddressed pain. And while the fight itself was painful, the deeper lesson was in recognizing the fragility of connection and the constant effort it takes to maintain love, trust, and understanding over time. That night, I realized something else. Knowing someone intimately is not the same as truly understanding them. Even in marriage, even after years of shared life, people can remain strangers in ways that are profound and unsettling. You can share a home, share a bed, share responsibilities, and yet still be strangers when conflict arises, because conflict exposes the unhealed, unspoken parts of ourselves that we often hide even from those we love most. The fight was a mirror, showing me not just the distance between us, but also the parts of myself I had neglected, ignored, or misunderstood. It was a painful awakening, one that forced me to confront the reality that love alone is not always enough to shield us from hurt, estrangement, or the harsh truths of human nature. It forced me to reflect, to question, and to grapple with the complexities of marriage in a way that was both terrifying and illuminating. That night, the comfort of familiarity was gone, replaced by a sobering awareness of vulnerability, the unpredictability of human emotion, and the ever-present need for empathy, patience, and communication. The fight was a cruel but necessary reminder that even those closest to us can become strangers if the bonds that connect us are not continually nurtured and cared for. The depth of hurt that night was something I had never imagined I could feel. It wasn't just the words he spoke, though they were sharp and cutting, each one landing like a jagged stone against my chest. It was more than that. It was the accumulation of everything unspoken, every disappointment, every unmet expectation, every small neglect that had quietly piled up over time. Pain in marriage is often subtle at first, almost invisible, like a slow leak in a boat. You notice it only when it becomes impossible to ignore, when it is soaked through every part of you and you realize you are sinking. That night, I felt that slow leak become a torrent, and I was drowning in a hurt so deep it consumed every part of me. I could feel it in my body first, a tightening in my chest, a heaviness in my limbs, a shiver that ran from my neck to my toes. My heart ached not just with sadness, but with a sharp, piercing pain that came from knowing that someone I loved so dearly could inflict such hurt, whether intentionally or not. There was a cruelty in it that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about love, about safety, about the home I had built with him. Every harsh word he uttered was not just heard but felt, vibrating through my entire being, making me feel as though I was breaking apart from the inside out. It was physical in its intensity, yet it was something far more than physical. It was a deep, emotional wound that cut straight to my soul. The thing about hurt is that it is cumulative. One word alone might sting, one moment might be bearable, but when they come in succession, layered upon each other, they have a power that is almost unbearable. That night, I realized that the pain of marriage is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, insidious, and relentless. It comes not from a single betrayal or a single act of cruelty, but from the slow accumulation of misunderstandings, miscommunications, and unmet emotional needs. Each comment, each glance, each tone that lacked warmth or kindness was a reminder that the love we had promised each other was fragile, vulnerable to neglect and human frailty. I tried to understand it, to rationalize it, to find some explanation for why the person I trusted so deeply could wound me so severely, but there was no satisfying answer. Hurt doesn't need an explanation to exist. It just is. It exists in the space between people when empathy fails, when anger overshadows compassion, when pride gets in the way of love. And that night, every ounce of pride, every grain of frustration, every hidden resentment that had accumulated over months or years seemed to rise to the surface, forming a wall between us that was almost impossible to scale. I felt trapped on one side, staring at someone I loved, someone I thought I knew, and realizing that love alone could not shield me from the pain I was feeling. Every harsh word seemed to echo in my mind long after it was spoken. I replayed the conversation over and over, dissecting it, questioning it, trying to understand if there was something I could have done differently, some way I could have softened the blow, prevented the storm. But the truth is that some pain is inevitable, some wounds are unavoidable, and some nights reveal the raw vulnerability that we carry within us, a vulnerability that cannot always be protected or concealed. That night, I felt mine in its purest form, raw and exposed, as if someone had ripped the walls from around my heart and left it open to the cold winds of disappointment and grief. The depth of hurt was not just emotional, it was also spiritual. I questioned my choices, my judgment, even my worth. If someone I loved so dearly could hurt me in such a profound way, did it mean I was undeserving of love? Did it mean I had failed in some fundamental way, as a partner, as a human being? These questions haunted me, looping endlessly in my mind, each repetition deepening the ache. I realized that pain in marriage is not only about the actions of the other person, but also about our own internal narratives, the way we interpret hurt, and the way it can magnify our fears and insecurities. I also noticed the physical manifestations of that hurt, the inability to sleep, the tightness in my chest that made it hard to breathe, the sense of nausea that accompanied every memory of the argument. Hurt is never just in the mind. It takes over the body as well, creating a totalizing experience that leaves you exhausted and raw. It was as though my entire being was attuned to the pain, unable to distract itself, unable to find solace. And in that moment, I realized that marriage can be one of the deepest sources of joy, but also one of the most profound sources of suffering. The very bond that brings comfort and security can also magnify disappointment, creating a paradox that is both beautiful and devastating. What made it even more painful was the silence that followed some of his words. Silence is heavy in its own way, a quiet accompaniment to the sharpness of conflict. Every pause was a reminder that understanding was absent, that empathy was delayed or denied, and that the space between us had grown wider. Sometimes it's the unsaid words, the unacknowledged feelings that hurt the most. That night I felt both, the piercing pain of what was said and the oppressive weight of what remained unspoken. Together, they created a depth of hurt that felt almost physical in its gravity, pressing down on my chest and making each breath feel like a labor. I could feel tears welling up, not just from sadness, but from the realization that love is not always enough to protect us from pain. You can give your heart fully, trust completely, and yet still be wounded in ways you never anticipated. The hurt is not a reflection of your failure alone, nor entirely of the other person's. It is a complex, interwoven experience, a product of human imperfection and the challenges of intimacy. And in that realization, the depth of hurt became almost a teacher, forcing me to confront not only the fragility of relationships, but also the depth of my own capacity to feel, to endure, and to survive. Even in the midst of that hurt, there was a strange clarity. I understood that pain is a part of love, that hurt is an inevitable companion to closeness, and that the most profound relationships often contain the potential for the deepest suffering. That night, the depth of hurt was a mirror, showing me how much I cared, how much I had invested, and how much I longed for connection, understanding, and reconciliation. It was a painful, almost unbearable truth, but it was a truth nonetheless. The hurt was real, undeniable, and all-encompassing, stretching from my heart to the very core of my being. By the end of the night, I was left with a profound sense of vulnerability, an acute awareness of how easily trust can be shaken, and how deep emotional wounds can run. I realized that marriage is not just about companionship or shared routines. It is about navigating the raw, sometimes brutal realities of human emotion. The depth of hurt I experienced was not just a momentary pain. It was a reflection of the intensity of love, of the stakes involved, and of the human need for connection and understanding. And though it was a night filled with tears, fear, and anguish, it also planted the seeds of awareness, reflection, and eventually resilience. That night, it wasn't just the words that hurt, it was the silence that came after. Sometimes silence is louder than any argument, heavier than any shouted accusation. There's a weight to silence, a stillness that presses into your chest and leaves no room to breathe, no place to hide. It's not just the absence of words, it's the absence of acknowledgement, of empathy, of understanding. That night, every pause between words, every hesitation, every unspoken thought felt like a wall closing in, separating us in ways that words alone could not have achieved. It was the kind of silence that makes you question not just your partner, but your own worth, your own place in their life, and even the meaning of your shared history. I remember sitting across from him, watching his face, waiting for some sign, some flicker of recognition that he understood the pain he was causing, but there was none, just stillness. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from calmness or reflection. It was heavy, tense, suffocating, like the air itself had been replaced by something cold and unyielding. Each second stretched endlessly, making my heart race and my chest tighten. Silence in that moment was not peaceful. It was a barrier, a reminder that connection had faltered, that the intimacy I had taken for granted was suddenly fragile, almost unreachable. What made the silence so painful was its insistence on reflection. In the absence of words, your mind begins to replay everything, analyzing every glance, every tone, every past argument. You start questioning your own actions, wondering if you did something wrong, if you failed to meet expectations, if the love you had given was not enough. Silence forces introspection in a way that words cannot. Words, even harsh ones, at least give you a target, something tangible to confront or respond to. Silence leaves you grasping at shadows, facing the unknown, and feeling profoundly alone even in the presence of the person who should be closest to you. I could feel it in the way my body reacted, the tightening of my chest, the lump in my throat, the way my hands trembled slightly as I tried to ground myself. Silence can manifest physically, as if the emptiness in the room has a weight that presses down on your very bones. It penetrates your awareness in a way that nothing else can. The absence of engagement, of reassurance, of care, speaks volumes. It shouts without sound. That night, I realized that sometimes the loudest screams in a marriage are not the ones spoken aloud, but the ones carried silently in the spaces between words. It wasn't only the immediate silence that hurt. It was the echo of past silences. Moments when he had walked away without explanation, when he had retreated emotionally during conflicts, when he had held back thoughts instead of sharing them. Those moments all came rushing back, each one amplified by the intensity of the fight that night. Silence is cumulative. Every unspoken word, every withheld feeling, every emotional withdrawal builds upon the last until it forms a chasm that seems impossible to cross. That night, I felt that chasm beneath me, widening with every second, threatening to swallow the connection we had fought so hard to maintain over the years. The irony of silence is that it often masks emotions rather than resolving them. A silent partner may not be indifferent, but the absence of communication leaves the other person guessing, interpreting, and often imagining the worst. An imagination, fueled by fear and pain, can become more damaging than reality. I found myself reading into his stillness, seeing in it rejection, judgment, and disappointment, whether or not it was truly there. Silence is a canvas on which the mind paints its darkest fears, and that night my mind was relentless. Every pause was an accusation, every hesitant glance a critique, and every quiet breath a reminder that I was standing alone in the emotional space we once shared. In that silence, I began to realize the profound vulnerability of emotional exposure. When words fail or when they are withheld, you are left confronting not just your partner's perceived distance, but also your own fears and insecurities. You are forced to face the raw reality that emotional intimacy is a delicate, living thing that requires constant care, attention, and courage. And when one person retreats into silence, it can feel like the entire foundation of trust and connection is shaking. That night, I felt that foundation quiver beneath me, and the sense of instability was almost unbearable. Silence also forces you to confront the truth of what you want and need. In the absence of communication, your desires and expectations come into sharp focus. I realized, painfully, that I had longed not just for reconciliation, but for acknowledgement, for empathy, for the simple assurance that my feelings mattered. Silence denied me that. It was not just the absence of words, it was the absence of validation. It left me feeling unseen, unheard, and profoundly isolated, a feeling far worse than any argument could have produced. In that quiet, I could hear the beating of my own heart, loud and insistent, reminding me that I still felt, still cared, and still longed for connection, even when it seemed impossible to achieve. The silence stretched on, each second amplifying the tension, until I felt like I was suspended in time. Every instinct screamed at me to fill the void, to speak, to plead, to demand recognition. But even as I tried to reach out, I realized that silence can be self-perpetuating. The harder you try to break it, the more resistant it becomes. It's a strange, paradoxical force, at once oppressive and evasive, heavy yet intangible, cruel yet strangely instructive. It forces you to confront your own emotions, to examine the roots of pain, and to reflect on the nature of intimacy and communication in ways that words alone rarely accomplish. By the end of the night, the silence had taught me a lesson I could not ignore. It revealed the fragility of connection, the importance of being present not just physically but emotionally, and the devastating effect that withdrawal can have on someone who loves you deeply. Silence is not neutral, it carries meaning, often more powerful than words themselves. That night, I felt every nuance of it, every unspoken thought, every withheld emotion, and every absent gesture. It was a heavy, relentless teacher, showing me how much can be lost when communication fails, and how deeply a heart can ache when it is met with nothing but quiet. That night, as the argument raged on, and the echoes of harsh words filled the walls of our home, I realized something terrifying. I felt lost in a place that was supposed to be my sanctuary. The home I had built, the space I had shared with him for years, no longer felt familiar. Every corner, every room, every piece of furniture that once held comfort and memories now felt alien, as if the walls themselves were bearing witness to a version of us that I didn't recognize. It was a strange, disorienting feeling, being surrounded by everything I knew and loved, yet feeling completely untethered, as though I had stepped into someone else's world. The home that was once a symbol of love, of partnership, and of shared dreams had turned into a maze in which I could not find my bearings. I walked from room to room, seeing the traces of our life together, the pictures on the walls, the chairs at the dinner table, the books we had read, the blankets we had shared, and each one felt like a reminder of a time that had already passed. It was as if our home was the same, but we were no longer the same. The familiarity that once brought comfort now brought a sharp, painful contrast to the reality of our conflict. I realized that a home is not just walls and furniture. It is the energy, the connection, the sense of safety and belonging that exists between the people who inhabit it, and that night that energy had vanished. I was surrounded by the physicality of our life, but the emotional core, the warmth, the intimacy, the understanding, was gone, leaving me adrift in a place that should have felt like mine. The feeling of being lost was compounded by the realization that I didn't just feel estranged from him. I felt estranged from myself in the context of this marriage. I questioned my own reactions, my own worth, my own ability to navigate love and partnership. Was I overreacting? Was I too sensitive? Was this really a reflection of him or of something within me? Every glance in the mirror seemed to confront me with the same unanswered questions. I saw the reflection of a woman I thought I knew, yet in that moment she seemed unfamiliar, fragile, and unmoored. Being lost in your own home is not just about physical disorientation. It's about a deeper, existential dislocation, a sense that the world you thought you inhabited so securely is shifting beneath your feet. I tried to make sense of it, to find the thread that could reconnect me to the life I had known. I remembered the early days of our marriage, the laughter, the whispers in the dark, the shared dreams and plans for the future. I thought of the small moments, the morning coffees, the quiet evenings, the comfort of knowing that someone was there for me no matter what. But those memories, instead of comforting me, now seemed bittersweet, almost cruel. They were reminders of what we had lost, of the gap that had grown between us, of the distance that words and silences together had created. Feeling lost in my own home was not just about disorientation, it was about grief, about mourning the version of our life that had existed before the fight, before the distance, before the silence. I noticed how even familiar routines had changed. The kitchen, where I once felt the warmth of shared breakfasts and conversations, now felt tense and heavy. The living room, once a place of comfort and togetherness, felt like a stage on which we performed our anger and frustration, each gesture and word amplified by the weight of the conflict. The bedroom, which had once been a place of intimacy and connection, felt cold and distant, a stark reminder of how the fight had invaded every corner of our shared space. Feeling lost in your own home is a profound reminder that home is not just about shelter. It is about the sense of security, belonging, and emotional connection that exists between the people who live within it. And when that connection is fractured, even the most familiar place can feel unfamiliar and threatening. I tried to reach out, to find a bridge back to him, to the life we had shared, but every attempt felt like stepping into quicksand. The more I tried to connect, the more distant he seemed, and the more lost I felt. It was as if the home itself had become a maze, each room a separate world, each hallway a reminder of how far apart we had drifted. I realized that being lost in your own home is not just about physical space. It is about emotional geography. You can be surrounded by everything you have ever known and still feel isolated, unseen, and disconnected. That night, the walls that should have held me felt like barriers, each one separating me from the person I loved and from the version of myself that had once felt secure within this life. The sense of loss was accompanied by fear that the distance might be permanent, that the estrangement was a glimpse of a future in which we would inhabit the same space, but live entirely separate lives. I thought of the vows we had made, of the promises of partnership and support, and wondered how fragile those words could be in the face of anger and miscommunication. The fear was not just for the present moment. It was for the trajectory of our lives, for the possibility that the connection we had once taken for granted could be irreparably damaged. Feeling lost in your own home forces you to confront the reality that love, even when strong, requires constant attention, empathy, and effort, and that even the most intimate relationships can fracture when those elements are missing. Amidst the fear and disorientation, I also felt a deep sense of loneliness. Loneliness is different when it occurs within a home shared with someone you love. It is not the absence of people, but the absence of connection. I was surrounded by someone I cared for deeply, yet I felt completely alone. The silence between us was deafening, and the spaces we had once filled with laughter and conversation now echoed with the emptiness of misunderstanding. I realized that being lost in your own home is, at its core, about being lost in your relationship, about feeling invisible to the one person who should see and understand you above all others. That night, the home was full of people and objects, but it was empty of the intimacy and recognition that made it feel like mine. As I wandered through the rooms, I noticed how the smallest things became magnified. The sound of his footsteps, once comforting, now felt like a reminder of distance. The way he avoided my gaze, which I had once interpreted as thoughtfulness, now felt like rejection. Every familiar object, every habitual gesture, was reframed in the context of conflict, highlighting the depth of the estrangement. Feeling lost in your own home is not a gradual realization. It is sudden, sharp, and disorienting, like waking up in a world that looks the same but no longer feels safe. By the end of the night, I understood that feeling lost in your own home is a powerful indicator of the state of your relationship. It is a symptom of emotional disconnection, of unspoken grievances, of unresolved conflicts, and of the fragility of intimacy. That night, being lost in the place I once called a sanctuary forced me to confront the reality of our marriage, to see the cracks that had been forming for months, and to recognize the work required to rebuild trust, connection, and understanding. It was a painful awakening, a vivid reminder that even in familiar spaces, without emotional alignment, we can feel profoundly alone and disoriented. That night, I felt broken in ways I had never known before. Not physically, not in any way that someone could see, but in a place deep inside me where love, trust, and hope intersect. Marriage, I realized, has the power to bring joy and fulfillment, but it also carries the potential to expose our most tender and fragile parts. In the heat of that fight, the person I thought I could always rely on, my partner, my confidant, the one I had promised to share my life with, had become a mirror reflecting my vulnerabilities back at me, raw and unguarded. The brokenness I felt wasn't just emotional, it was existential, as if the foundation of my sense of self had cracked under the weight of hurt and disappointment. I remember the exact moment when I first became aware of the depth of my vulnerability. It wasn't in the words he said, though they were sharp and piercing. It was in the look on his face, the indifference, the distance, the subtle hardness that seemed to have replaced the warmth I had known for years. In that moment, I realized that I had exposed my heart fully, laid it bare in trust and love, and now it was being held at arm's length by the person I had trusted most. There was no malice in his actions, perhaps, but there was a coldness, an emotional absence that made my heart ache in ways I could hardly describe. Brokenness and vulnerability are not always the result of intention. Sometimes they emerge simply from the reality of human imperfection and the fragility of emotional bonds. The feeling of being broken was compounded by the realization that my vulnerability had been visible all along. Every expectation I had, every hope I nurtured, every silent plea for understanding had been placed in the open, and now it seemed like a liability rather than a gift. To feel vulnerable is to trust, and trust in marriage is the greatest gift we can give, but it is also the greatest risk. That night, I understood how exposing the heart fully makes us susceptible to pain, because love cannot exist without openness, and openness cannot exist without the potential for hurt. Each glance, each pause, each unspoken word was a reminder that I had placed my heart in someone else's hands, and that even the closest person can sometimes fail to meet us where we are. Brokenness also brought a strange clarity. I could see in that fractured state the ways in which I had tried to protect myself in the past, the walls I had built to guard against disappointment, and how those walls had been dismantled, piece by piece, by trust, love, and commitment. Vulnerability is not something we can turn on and off. It is a living, breathing state, and it requires courage to embrace. That night, courage felt impossible, but it was precisely because of that courage that I had allowed myself to feel so deeply, to invest so fully, and to experience love in its purest form. And with love comes the possibility of pain, the inevitability of hurt, and the revelation of our most fragile parts. As I sat in the silence that followed our argument, I felt a profound sense of exposure. Brokenness is not merely an emotional sensation. It is a state of being that permeates every part of your life. You see it in your trembling hands, in the quickened pulse, in the way your chest tightens with every thought of the conflict. You feel it in your mind, where worries and doubts spiral endlessly, questioning not only your partner, but also yourself, your decisions, your worth, and your ability to navigate love and intimacy. Brokenness forces introspection, demanding that you confront not only the actions of others, but also the hidden fears and insecurities that live within you. Vulnerability, I realized, is both painful and transformative. To allow someone into the deepest corners of your heart is to open yourself to hurt, but it is also to create the possibility for profound connection and healing. That night, I felt both extremes, the agony of brokenness and the quiet awareness that vulnerability is necessary for love to flourish. The juxtaposition of these emotions was dizzying. It is a paradox. The very act of being fully open, fully honest, and fully invested is what allows us to experience both the deepest hurt and the most meaningful intimacy. And in that moment, I felt every nuance of that paradox, every heartbeat carrying both pain and potential, every tear a testament to the depth of my emotional investment. The brokenness extended beyond the immediate moment of conflict. I began to notice how it touched my perception of myself and my relationship. Every memory, every shared experience, every promise we had made seemed tinged with fragility. I questioned whether our past moments of happiness were genuine, or whether they were temporary reprieves from the underlying tension that had now surfaced. Brokenness has a way of magnifying the smallest cracks in a relationship, forcing you to confront the fragility of what you once assumed was solid and secure. That night, I felt every crack, every fissure, every fracture, as though the entire structure of our life together was being examined under a harsh, unforgiving light. Yet, amid the despair, there was also an awareness that brokenness can be a catalyst for growth. To feel vulnerable and exposed is to acknowledge the depth of your humanity, the intensity of your capacity for love, and the courage required to open your heart fully. Brokenness does not erase love, it refines it. It forces us to confront what we value, what we need, and what we are willing to endure for the people we care about. That night, I was forced to grapple with these truths, to acknowledge the fragility of my emotional state, and to recognize the resilience that resides within even the most wounded heart. I also realized that vulnerability is a shared experience. Though I felt exposed and broken, I understood that he, too, had his own vulnerabilities, his own fears, his own insecurities. Marriage is a dance of openness and trust, and each partner brings their own history, their own pain, and their own emotional landscape into the shared space. That night, the collision of our vulnerabilities created a storm, each one amplifying the other, leaving both of us raw, exposed, and emotionally exhausted. Brokenness is rarely one-sided. It is a reflection of the complex interplay between two imperfect human beings striving to connect, to understand, and to love each other despite their flaws. By the end of that night, I felt the full weight of brokenness and vulnerability pressing down on me. I was raw, unguarded, and exposed, yet I was also alive in a way that only profound emotional experiences can make us feel. The brokenness was not the end of the story. It was a necessary part of the journey, a painful but vital step towards self-awareness, empathy, and deeper connection. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is the courage to face the truth of our emotions, to bear the weight of love and hurt simultaneously, and to continue striving for connection, even when the risk of pain feels unbearable. That night, after the harsh words, the silences, and the weight of brokenness, I found myself questioning everything, not just the argument itself, not just the immediate conflict, but the very foundation of my marriage, my choices, and my life. Questions flooded my mind with a force I could not control, relentless in their persistence. I questioned him, of course, wondering what had brought us to this place of such profound distance and pain. But I also questioned myself, my decisions, my worth, and even the love I had believed in so fully. Marriage, I realized, has a way of magnifying doubts, of exposing insecurities, and of forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our relationships. That night, I was forced to face all of it at once. I questioned why we had built a life together that could feel so fragile under the weight of a single fight. How had we reached a point where one disagreement could leave me feeling untethered, like I was standing on the edge of a precipice with no solid ground beneath my feet? I wondered if the years of shared experiences, laughter, and dreams had been enough to truly sustain us. Had we been naive, believing that love alone would protect us from pain? The questions felt endless, circling in my mind without resolution, each one cutting deeper than the last. I questioned my own judgment, wondering if I had overlooked signs, ignored warnings, or failed to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. Had I been blind to the subtle tensions that had accumulated over time? Had I been too trusting, too forgiving, too willing to give love without guarding my own heart? These questions were not born of anger, but of the deep, aching vulnerability that comes when you realize that someone you trusted completely can hurt you in ways you never anticipated. Questioning everything became both a defense mechanism and a reflection of the profound emotional impact the night had left on me. I questioned him, too, in ways that were painful to admit. Did he love me as I loved him? Did he care about the sanctity of the promises we had made? Was the person I had married the same person sitting across from me now? Or had we both changed, grown apart without realizing it, until the distance was too wide to bridge? These questions were not accusatory. They were desperate attempts to understand the incomprehensible, to find meaning in the chaos of a relationship that suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. The truth was elusive, hidden beneath layers of pride, miscommunication, and the raw emotions that had overtaken us that night. I questioned the nature of love itself. If love can hurt this deeply, if trust can shatter so quickly, if intimacy can be replaced with estrangement in a matter of hours, what does that say about the human heart and its capacity to connect? Love had been my anchor, my guiding force, my reason for believing in a shared future. Yet that night, it seemed insufficient, fragile, and vulnerable to forces I could not control. I realized that love is not a guarantee of safety. It is a choice, a continuous effort, a fragile balance between giving and receiving, between vulnerability and self-preservation. Questioning everything meant questioning whether the very foundation upon which I had built my life could withstand the realities of human imperfection. I questioned the memories we had created together. Every laugh, every intimate moment, every promise whispered in the quiet of night suddenly carried a weight of uncertainty. Had those moments been real, or had I merely been clinging to an illusion, convincing myself that everything was stable when, in reality, cracks had been forming silently beneath the surface? Questioning the past was painful, but unavoidable. Memories are fragile, and when trust is shaken, they become both a comfort and a torment, reminding us of what once was while highlighting the fragility of what remains. I questioned the future as well. Could we repair the damage? Could we rebuild the connection that felt so fragile, so broken, so distant in that moment? Was there a path forward, or were we destined to continue drifting apart, living side by side as strangers in a home that once felt like a sanctuary? The uncertainty was overwhelming, each possibility more frightening than the last. Questioning everything meant not only examining the present and the past, but also peering into an unknown future with fear and trepidation, wondering if the love I held onto so tightly could survive the trials that life and human imperfection had thrust upon us. I questioned myself in ways I had never done before. What did I truly want from this marriage? Was I willing to fight for it, to weather the storms, to endure the hurt and the silences, or had I reached the limits of my emotional endurance? Questioning everything became a mirror, reflecting not just the cracks in our relationship, but also the cracks within myself, the insecurities, fears, and doubts I had carried silently, even before the argument began. It was a painful self-examination, forcing me to confront my own needs, my own limitations, and my own capacity for love, forgiveness, and resilience. The act of questioning everything was exhausting. My mind raced endlessly, jumping from one doubt to another, from one fear to another. Sleep eluded me, and even the simplest tasks felt heavy with the weight of introspection. Every glance at him, every sound he made, every pause in conversation became loaded with meaning, interpreted through the lens of doubt and uncertainty. Questioning everything is not just a mental exercise. It is a full body experience, an emotional storm that takes over your thoughts, your heart, and your spirit, leaving you raw and exposed. Yet, in the midst of this turmoil, there was also a strange clarity. Questioning everything forced me to confront the reality of our relationship without illusions. It forced me to see both the beauty and the fragility of love, the strength and the vulnerability of human connection, and the work required to sustain intimacy and trust. It forced me to ask the difficult questions, even when the answers were unclear, because only by confronting uncertainty could I hope to understand, to grow, and to navigate the challenges that lay ahead. By the end of that night, I realized that questioning everything was both painful and necessary. It was a reflection of my investment in our marriage, of my desire for connection, and of my unwillingness to accept complacency in the face of hurt. It revealed the depth of my care, the intensity of my emotions, and the courage it takes to face the unknown, both within myself and within the relationship. Questioning everything was not a sign of weakness. It was a testament to the seriousness with which I approached love, commitment, and the shared life we had built. After the storm of that night, after the harsh words, the silences, the brokenness, and the overwhelming sense of being lost, I realized that there was a path forward. It wasn't obvious, and it certainly wasn't easy. Healing never comes in neat, predictable steps. Reflection and growth are messy, slow, and often painful, but they are necessary if we are to move past the hurt and rebuild the connection that had been strained to its limits. That night, I understood that the first step toward healing was not in fixing him or in demanding change, but in looking inward and confronting my own emotions honestly. Reflection, I realized, is not passive. It is an active engagement with pain, a conscious choice to examine the heart, the mind, and the soul, even when every part of you wants to look away. I began by acknowledging the hurt without judgment. It would have been easy to minimize my feelings, to tell myself that I was overreacting, that love should be enough to shield me from pain. But reflection requires honesty, and honesty meant admitting to myself just how deeply I had been wounded. I let myself feel the anger, the sadness, the disappointment, and the fear. I allowed the tears to flow freely, without shame or restraint, because bottled emotions serve no one, least of all the heart that is hurting. In that moment, I realized that acknowledging pain is not weakness. It is a crucial first step in the journey toward understanding, growth, and eventual healing. Reflection also meant examining my role in the conflict. It is easy to blame, to point fingers, to convince yourself that you are the only one suffering or that you are entirely right. But true reflection demands self-examination. I asked myself hard questions. Had I contributed to the tension? Had I allowed my own insecurities, expectations, or pride to fuel the conflict? Could I have communicated more clearly, more lovingly, or with greater patience? Facing these questions was uncomfortable, but necessary. Growth does not happen in the safety of defensiveness. It happens in the willingness to confront our own imperfections and recognize the ways in which we shape, and are shaped by, the dynamics of our relationships. I realized that reflection is not just about analyzing the past. It is also about envisioning the future. Healing begins when we imagine a path forward, a life in which connection and trust can be restored, even if it requires effort, courage, and vulnerability. I thought about the small gestures that could rebuild the bond, listening without judgment, expressing my feelings with clarity, acknowledging his perspective, and extending compassion even when it was difficult. I understood that healing is incremental, often consisting of countless small steps rather than a single grand gesture. It is the gentle return of empathy, patience, and care that slowly closes the gaps created by hurt. The path to healing also required forgiveness, not necessarily immediate or complete, but a willingness to release the grip of resentment and bitterness that can prevent growth. Forgiveness is not about excusing hurtful behavior. It is about freeing your own heart from the corrosive effects of anger and despair. I reflected on the love that had existed before the fight, on the shared memories and dreams that still mattered, and I allowed myself to imagine a future where those things could coexist with the lessons learned from pain. Forgiveness became a bridge, not to deny the hurt, but to acknowledge it and move forward without being trapped by it. Reflection and healing demanded patience as well. Emotional wounds do not close overnight. The hurt of that night would linger, the memories of harsh words and silences would remain, and the scars of broken trust would take time to fade. But patience is not passive. It is an active commitment to giving yourself and your relationship the time and space to process, to grow, and to evolve. I reminded myself that every effort, every attempt at communication, every act of empathy was a small step toward restoring what had been shaken. Patience allowed me to temper the intensity of my emotions with the understanding that real healing unfolds gradually, often in ways we cannot predict or control. I also learned that healing requires vulnerability, the willingness to show up fully, to express my feelings honestly, and to risk being hurt again in the pursuit of connection. That night had reminded me that marriage is not just about comfort or routine. It is about intimacy, trust, and the courage to face one another with open hearts. Reflection allowed me to recognize the value of vulnerability, not as a source of weakness, but as the essential element of meaningful connection. Without it, love remains superficial, fragile, and incapable of weathering the storms that life inevitably brings. As I reflected on the night, I began to notice subtle shifts within myself. I felt a quiet strength emerging from the acknowledgement of my own resilience. I had survived the emotional intensity, endured the pain, and remained willing to confront both my feelings and the realities of my marriage. This strength was not loud or boastful. It was quiet, steady, and enduring, a reminder that the heart is capable of enduring hardship while still remaining open to love. Reflection allowed me to see that brokenness, hurt, and vulnerability do not diminish us. They refine us, revealing our capacity to grow, adapt, and connect more deeply. Healing, I realized, is also about perspective. Pain often feels overwhelming when experienced in isolation, but when we step back and view the bigger picture, we can begin to see the lessons embedded within it. That night, I saw that conflict, though excruciating in the moment, could serve as a catalyst for greater understanding, empathy, and emotional maturity. Reflection allowed me to reframe the pain not as a permanent state, but as a temporary challenge, an opportunity to strengthen the emotional bonds that had been tested. It was a reminder that even the most intense hurt carries within it the seeds of transformation, if we are willing to nurture them. Finally, the path to healing required hope. Reflection without hope is incomplete, for it is hope that motivates us to act, to reach out, and to rebuild. I envisioned a future where the distance, anger, and silences of that night could give way to renewed connection, deeper understanding, and a love tempered by experience. Hope is the recognition that even after profound hurt, the heart has the capacity to recover, to forgive, and to open itself to love once more. It is the belief that relationships are living entities, capable of growth, repair, and renewal when nurtured with care, patience, and empathy. By the end of my reflection, I realized that the journey to healing had already begun. I could not erase the pain, nor could I undo the events of that night, but I could choose to engage with it, to understand it, and to allow it to shape me into a more empathetic, patient, and resilient person. Reflection and healing are intertwined. One cannot exist without the other. Through reflection, we confront the truth of our emotions, our relationships, and our own vulnerabilities. Through healing, we transform that truth into growth, understanding, and a renewed capacity for love. The path is not simple, and it is certainly not quick, but it is a path worth taking, because on the other side lies not just recovery, but a deeper, more authentic connection with ourselves and with those we love.